Hi, I'm Jonathan Treussard, and welcome to Treussard Talks, where we talk about the mechanics of investing, the psychology of investing, and what it means to manage your wealth with purpose. Because understanding your wealth shouldn't be as complex as building it. Welcome to today's show. Zvi Bodie, welcome to Treussard Talks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, when my daughters, your granddaughters, were younger, and the world did surprising things, they used to say, it is not supposed to be happening. And I feel that both my life as well as your life somewhat follows that edict. It was not supposed to be happening.
Yes, it certainly wasn't expected. Let's put it like that.
That's right. And so obviously we can talk about how we met, and we will, and the type of work that we did together long before I became your son-in-law. But let's start at the beginning of your journey, starting in Brooklyn, through Brooklyn College, MIT, teaching at BU, so on and so forth. So take me back to the beginning.
Okie doke. Here it comes. Although I have to start by saying that I first met you at Boston University when you were a doctoral student in the economics department. But you took my course in the theory of finance, which was a doctoral level course. And I'd give out weekly problem sets, and you would always solve all the problems correctly. So what would happen is I'd start the class by calling you up to the blackboard to put your solution on the board. And it was always right. In fact, you may have had to correct me in some instances. But you were by far and away the best doctoral student I ever had at Boston University.
I'll take it.
Right, exactly. That's the opening. Now, with regard to my background, I grew up in Brooklyn in a predominantly working class Catholic neighborhood. There were very few Jews there, but I was one of them. I grew up in a Jewish family, which, as it turns out, played a dominant part in my teenage years and early 20s. My father was a plumber. I would work with him on weekends, and I wish I could remember the plumbing that I learned back then, because I sure could use it in the house I live in now. But I don't remember any of it, so that's life. My mother was a housewife, although she also worked in a rooming house owned by my grandparents in Coney Island, which was maybe a half-hour drive from our house. What I remember from that rooming house is this was in the days, the early 50s, and this rooming house still had ice boxes for the tenants. So I would sometimes have to go buy blocks of ice, cart them to the rooming house. It was called the Atlas Hotel, but it was really just a rooming house, and load the ice into the ice box. That was the refrigerator at that time. Now, very important fact was that I loved school. I really loved, I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but I loved school because I did well in school. And I graduated, well, let's put it like this. I went to a special high school. In New York City, there are 3 exam high schools that you have to take to get admission.
Brooklyn Tech.
Was Brooklyn Tech, which was oriented towards preparing people for careers as engineers. So I remember I had 4 years worth of technical drafting. That was part of it. And also we had foundry, we had shop classes, all of which were intended to get us prepared for careers in engineering. And in the beginning, when I graduated and went to Brooklyn College, which was a pretty good university, part of the City University of New York, I was pre-engineering. But after my first year, I said, no, this is not for me. So I wound up as a philosophy major. And I did like economics.
Making good use of your hands.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Imagining, okay, what things would look like after I engineered them. Brooklyn College is where I met my wife. We subsequently got married, but we were both pretty young when we met. That must have been the early 60s. And we both got involved in the Zionist movement during our college careers. So this is the Jewish connection. And when we graduated in 1965, we went to live on a kibbutz in Israel with a group. There must have been about 20 people in the group.
You did the crossing by boat?
Yes, we did. We crossed by boat. I still remember that we were on the SS Israel. That was the name of the boat, crossing the Atlantic. And we were headed for Barcelona on our way to Israel.
Wow.
I remember watching a movie below deck, and it was very rough seas. And we were watching this movie. We were sitting in chairs that weren't tied down to anything. So we were sliding from one side to the other side of the deck and getting seasick.
I believe it.
But eventually we first went to Spain, then we went to Italy, a week in each place, and finally wound up on the kibbutz where we lived for a couple of years. And we actually, right after the Six-Day War, this was June of 1967, we got married. And there were 3 other couples that got married at the same time. So the kibbutz celebrated all 4 weddings on the same date, and it was the 4th of July, 1967. And not long after that, we left the kibbutz, decided that was not our desired way of life. And Judy, my wife, we moved to Jerusalem, and Judy was pregnant with our older daughter, not the one who married you eventually, Mariah, but rather Laura, who was 5 years older than Mariah. And she was born in Jerusalem. And I went to the Hebrew University. I went back to school, did a master's degree in economics. I got very interested in economics. And the way I got interested in economics is I came across Samuelson's textbook in economics.
Oh.
And I really loved the field. And little did I know that eventually I would become a good friend of Paul Samuelson's at MIT as a doctoral student. So that takes us up to, I finished my master's degree at Jerusalem, and I applied to the PhD program at MIT in economics, was accepted, and I had financial support, actually, from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem because they wanted me to come back and teach economics.
And at that point, you're still very much thinking you're going to be a mainstream economist, not a financial economist.
Oh, yeah, right. No connection to finance other than as an economist.
Sure.
You can't avoid finance if you're an economist.
Same way I started.
Yeah, that's right. That is exactly true. And then I got into the PhD program, and the guy who really got me interested in finance was none other than Robert C. Murray, who was just starting out this was 1970, was it 70? Or 69 or 70?
Some version of that.
Yeah, late 60s. He had finished his PhD under the tutelage of Paul Samuelson at MIT. And Franco Modigliani, another Nobel Prize winner in economics who was at MIT, convinced Bob Merton teach finance. And he didn't know finance. I mean, his thesis was financy.
Right. Well, it's not like there was a curriculum that was really well established at the time in finance.
No. And so he started teaching. He taught the graduate level Intro to Finance course, which I took. And he and I really hit it off, largely because everything he said made complete sense to me. And I would make suggestions. I would write things for him and to him. Anyhow, we became...
And you guys became friends, and you had, obviously, Paul Samuelson in common.
Correct. Exactly. And Franco Modigliani.
Right.
Two of the, leading lights, pioneers of financial economics.
And you just said something that's interesting. You just said everything, and you're attributing it to Merton, but I think you're really speaking to the body of knowledge and the body of work that was emerging at the time. Everything that he said made sense. So if you think about those kind of foundational pieces of knowledge where you said, yep, that's the way to think about it, what comes to mind?
Okay, so first of all, the theory of life cycle saving and investing looked at through models that took into account dynamics and uncertainty. Now, as it turns out, you, I, and Paul Willen subsequently wrote an article called The Theory of Life Cycle Saving and Investing. But what we did was we tried to translate all of that into non-mathematical terms.
Right.
Remember then it was for
I
a
do.
Federal Reserve Bank of Boston conference. That's a good paper.
It is a good paper. And I think, again, we'll go back to that. But, as people think about your contribution to finance and economics and crossing or building a bridge between the theory and the practice, looking back on your body of work, it is that piece that's really important about translating, about making it more accessible. That's been carrying through your entire body of work. And we can talk about the papers that you've written with others, people like Bob Merton, with myself, and importantly, your textbooks and your more popular books like Worry-Free Investing, where it's always been about communicating in a clear, actionable fashion the essence of kind of the knowledge in play.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This is shades of the days when you were a PhD student taking my class.
So tell me if this is part of your doctoral work, or I know it was around that time, but you wrote what I would argue is a classic, looking at common stocks as a hedge against inflation. And so tell me more about that.
Yeah. So my thesis, my doctoral thesis, which was written under the supervision of Stan Fisher, who was on the faculty at MIT at that time.
Subsequently became the head of the central bank in Israel. Is that correct?
Correct. And he was...
Among many other things.
Among many other things, yes. He's now in a assisted living facility outside of Boston. Very sad. He's the same age as I am. He's like 82, I think. Anyhow, Stan Fisher supervised my thesis. The topic was hedging against inflation, because at the time, that was a hot topic. How do you deal with inflation? But it's something that you want to hedge against or insure against. One of the papers I wrote was entitled Inflation Insurance. I've written a lot about that subject for a couple of reasons. But stocks were said to be a good inflation hedge. And the first thing I did in my thesis was show that stocks aren't good hedge against inflation, because what you mean by a hedge against inflation is some investment that goes up if inflation goes up. It protects you against inflation. So it has to be highly correlated with inflation. And stocks, at best, are inflation neutral. They're not highly correlated, they're uncorrelated with inflation. So they can't be a hedge. But worse than that, I found that for the most part, they were negatively correlated with inflation. So that's even worse. And people were saying at the time, yeah, the stock market goes down, but in the long run, stocks are going to beat everything else. So this was called Stocks for the Long Run. I wrote a paper on stocks for the long run where I showed that quite the opposite. The conventional wisdom was if you hold on long enough, stocks are going to outperform everything else.
Right.
Certainly going to outperform bonds and any kind of inflation hedge that you are holding on to. What I showed was that's a fallacy. Now, the fact that stocks are not, let's call it the fallacy of the long run. Merton and Samuelson had written a couple of papers showing that theoretically speaking, that's not true. That there is no such thing as stocks being safe in the long run, risky in the short run, and safe in the long run.
Right.
My contribution was to show that if you wanted to buy insurance, a put option, okay, which is insurance against stock market failing to beat safe assets,
Right.
that the price of that insurance, using none other than the Merton Scholes, the
Black-Scholes,
Black-Scholes,
Merton.
Merton, thank you, option pricing model gives the opposite result. The longer the time horizon, the more expensive the insurance. That appealed to Samuelson. He liked that argument a lot.
And again, it's one of those things that's so complicated for people to understand in the face of what people would perceive to be experience, right? The lived experience for an American investor over the course of the last century is some version of bad things happen to the stock market, and if you wait long enough, it'll come back. And that's their lived sample, for lack of a better description.
Right.
But what you're saying is, well, okay, that's great. That's one run of history, and it has happened. No one is denying it. I would argue there are limitations to that run of history. There are plenty of stock markets around the world, and there are good papers written about that suffered irreparable damage in the face of structural changes, whether it's war or just a change in regime. I would imagine it is possible that at some point countries like Venezuela had reasonable stock markets, and of course they don't anymore, but other countries had perfectly fine stock markets and of course disappeared in the midst of geopolitical changes in Europe and in Central Europe. So part of it is one run of history, while it may feel very compelling, does not make for empirical relevance. And the other thing, which is what I think your angle of attack is, wait a minute, if you're saying something is safe in the long run, it ought to be that, relatively speaking, the cost of insurance for that thing ought to be declining with time, right? Because if it's safe, it should cost you less to insure it. And what you're saying is using foundational models in pricing risk, you're finding the opposite.
Right.
Thanks for listening. I'm Jonathan Treussard, founder of Treussard Capital Management. I hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to start receiving my free newsletter, Wealth Empowered, or if you'd like to learn more about me and Treussard Capital Management, go to Treussard.com. That's TREUSSARD.com. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Now, the other thing that, I don't know if you want to call it a contribution, but it certainly made it into my doctoral dissertation and then subsequently became a theme of mine at a practical level, was inflation-protected government bonds. Said at the time, where in the United States there were no such thing as inflation-protected government bonds. So there was no risk-free asset. We talked about a risk-free asset. And there were risk-free assets in nominal terms, okay, that is to say in dollars, but not in real terms, not in inflation-adjusted terms. And it wasn't until 1998 that the U.S. Treasury finally started issuing inflation-protected bonds of two sorts, TIPS and I bonds. And I became a champion of Series I savings bonds. I mean, to the point where they would joke, here comes the I bond, you know.
Well, and you wrote Worry-Free Investing around that
Exactly.
time or shortly thereafter. But again, I want to touch on two things there. The concept of risk-free and why, if you kind of go back to the essence of what saving and investing is about, it's about moving resources through time and space in a way that ideally allows for you to make use of those resources at a different point in time and a different state of the world, as we would call it.
With no
And
uncertainty.
and
Right.
with no uncertainty that requires having inflation being handled, right? Because otherwise, if you're shoving $100 bill under your mattress and you pull it out 20 years down the line, you don't know what that thing's going to buy you. It might just buy you an ice cream cone. So that's part of it. Of course, the other part of it relates to your enamorment with that concept. Again, tell me, I remember you handing me a paper that I think Stan Fisher had written about inflation protection around that time in the mid 60s or early 70s, right? So, I mean, this is when people talk about to what extent do economists have an impact on public policy and outcomes, hopefully for the better sometimes, the idea of an inflation protected bond didn't just come out of nowhere in 1997 at the U.S. Treasury.
No, absolutely. In fact, what got me completely involved with them was the fact that I remembered they existed in Israel back in the 1960s. So Israel, which had serious problems with inflation, the government had to issue inflation protected bonds, not linked, not dollar inflation protected, but Israeli shekel
Right.
protected.
Well, and so that's actually an interesting bridge because you got your PhD at MIT, you started teaching at BU. Along the way, you took a sabbatical, I guess, from teaching at BU to go over to Harvard and work with Merton and many others on the concept of functional finance and structural finance, which I really, is core to the way I think about the world in terms of, as a society, we have a handful of functions. We have a handful of must do from a financial and economic standpoint. And then we get to choose how we organize ourselves around those activities. One is things like, hey, it'd be nice to have the ability to actually move resources through time and space in a safe way. But importantly, in a well-functioning system, which is a privilege, not a right, the government responds to the inherent pressures to governing itself, right? So what you're saying is, look, in Israel, you've got a new nation facing the very real challenges of establishing itself as a nation, but also the very real costs of defending itself, which are inherently inflationary. And so, not surprising, necessity being the mother of all invention, inflation-protected bonds come out of a place where creativity is required to get buy-in from investors.
Yes, and in fact, in the case of Israel in the 1960s and 70s, all bonds became inflation protected. I mean, you couldn't sell bonds that weren't inflation.
Right. The demand for those were negative.
Correct.
All right, so tell us more about this concept of functional finance and again, how you and Bob and others kind of got to that thought.
Right. So the basic idea, he and I wound up writing a number of papers on this. It's the idea, I think he was influenced by his father, Robert K. Merton, a very famous sociologist. And the basic idea is that financial institutions vary tremendously across countries, and they change quite a bit over time. So, but just as one example, in the United States, we used to have defined benefit pension plans.
Pensions.
Pensions, right, in the original sense of the word, that you worked for a certain number of years, you retired, and you had a fixed, periodic pension benefit, like Social Security.
Right.
Okay.
People call this mailbox money, right?
Oh, is that right? I never
Yeah.
heard that.
The point is the concept of a pension was once you put in your years of service, every month, like clockwork, there would be money showing up in your mailbox, if you will. Or,
Right.
now it would be electronic.
Right. So there's hardly any private entities. There's still government pension plans still exist, but there are virtually no company pension plans anymore of the defined benefit type. They're all defined contribution. And that's a whole new industry. And alongside of that industry, you have the mutual fund industry, which mutual funds didn't exist all that long ago. So, I mean, the investment industry is a good example of where you have new types of institutions coming into existence practically every decade.
Right. And again, the idea being, hey, we've got these basic requirements, things like saving for our later
Right.
years. That's a structural requirement in a world in which we're going to live longer than we're going to work. And then we have to figure out how to solve for that as a society. And one version of that is, hey, you work for a company for decades and you accrue benefits. And at the end of it, you start getting these checks like clockwork, hopefully. And again, you've done some interesting work on the hopefully part, which is this assumes that nothing bad happens to this, I guess, whatever we want to call it, this uncollateralized or perhaps not perfectly collateralized liability that the company has for you. But if for some reason the world changes, that's not a good arrangement anymore. So it doesn't work for everybody. And in this current case, it just stopped working for the companies. And maybe you can explain why. Then something else will kind of reveal itself. And of course, through social learnings and developments, that's the birth of the 401k plan and all of that. And of course, some of it solving a societal issue, some of it opening a door for, as you said, a whole new range of people making money as a result from the financial industry.
Correct. And the issue of saving for retirement, why did defined benefit plans in the private sector disappear? Answer, because companies change. Companies go bankrupt. And then their pension plan in the United States, the landmark case was Studebaker Automobile Company went bankrupt, and thousands of workers who were depending on that company for their retirement income didn't have it. So, all right. So the point is that there are these functions, and one of them is providing for the transfer of resources over time, and the other part is the shifting of risk or the management of risk. It's another function. And how is that handled? Through some, combination of government and private sector. There have been tremendous changes in the United States. So at any rate, at Harvard, we established a group that took the framework. Anyhow, that group, which worked together for 2 years, we organized a couple of conferences. We published a book, The U.S. Financial System, A Functional Perspective. Merton and I took a look at how guarantee programs are managed, which is a clear example of risk management. And we wrote a couple of papers on the efficient management of guarantees. And of course, it was influenced by his theoretical work on options.
Right. If you're a fund that is supposed to be a backstop to some kind of risk, it's probably not ideal to double down on that risk. The perfect example of that being the old PBGC, and I guess the PBGC is still kicking around somewhere, investing in stocks, even though part of the issue would be
Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation.
and, one of the things that I like to explore as part of these conversations is always the intersection of mechanics and psychology. And I think you're speaking to a lot of that. And here, what's interesting is when you think about the functional approach to finance and the fact that just things change, right? At any given point in time, we walk around with a bunch of kind of shortcuts, mental shortcuts, right? Oh, the way you solve for this is you have a pension. And all of a sudden it just becomes part of, the accepted set of solutions, and everybody's walking around thinking that's how we do this thing. We have pensions. And then of course the world changes, the risk profile of certain activities change. The shorthand, the kind of the mental shortcut, I guess heuristic we would call it, that people walk around with is challenged, right? So all of a sudden the thing that used to make sense doesn't make sense, and the way the world tells you it doesn't make sense anymore is often there are crises and things kind of falling apart. And then the society at large is forced to rethink.
Correct. And, crises generally are caused by the unexpected happening. And often psychology is involved, group psychology, like when massive shifts out of a particular type of asset. Bank runs being an example. Well, there are runs of every sort, not just bank runs. There are runs out of particular asset categories. What comes to my mind, because it was so close to where I was at the time, is the LTCM crisis. Do you remember that?
I do, but tell us more.
Okay. So Bob Merton got hooked up with some Wall Street sharpshooters. Very nice guys, by the way. No women involved, as far as I can recall. And they set up a company. It was basically a hedge fund.
One of the first kind of superstar hedge funds, right?
That's correct. And that was using technology, the financial technology, largely based on Merton's contributions. He was sort of the father of financial engineering, no question. The option pricing model was just one of many instances of application of his technology. His approach to finance became known as contingent claims analysis.
You and I wrote a piece at the end of my doctoral years applying contingent claims analysis to the issue of managing human capital and the life cycle model, thinking about careers as fundamentally a basket of options. You can do this, you can do that, you can try different careers and try to optimize it.
Right. And financial engineering exists today. Still, it's become the applied part of financial science.
Right.
And financial science is really relatively young science. It didn't really exist until the 1960s.
Right. But at LTCM, the basic things had to do with statistical relationships, right? Things that are supposed to move together or behave in a certain way based on data and historical relationships. And of course, the world having a uncanny ability to surprise you. And this is 1997, 1998. A couple of things happened around the world that basically made these statistical relationships, put them in the penalty box for a minute. The problem is when you put a statistical relationship in the penalty box and you've got big levered bets on it, bad things happen.
Exactly. And this LTCM, this hedge fund, had investments from all the big investment firms. I mean, Pete Morgan was invested in it, and I think at some point Lehman Brothers also, when Lehman Brothers still existed.
That's also an interesting part, which is when you think about the plumbing of finance, some of the fragilities come from the fact that there is herding, there is joint behavior, where all of a sudden, if someone's doing this cool new thing, everybody else wants to be doing it. And all of a sudden, we've got this issue, which is something that used to be what we would describe as idiosyncratic risk that only matters to one person, one institution, one bank, becomes systemic or societal risk because everybody's in on it.
In fact, I remember I was talking with Judy, my wife, about LTCM just this morning, and she reminded me that it was a big deal. A lot of people we knew went broke, and it was precipitated by the bankruptcy of the Russian government.
Yeah, that's right. I just talked to somebody else recently, and we were talking about the tech bubble, right? This is one of the things that I struggle with, and I think it's a challenge for everybody. As I was describing earlier, we're all just staring at one data point, which is the history of American enterprise, the history of American economic resilience, the history of our financial system. And it is shocking the number of times that bad things have happened and we've recovered. And we don't have to go all the way back to the antediluvian times, but obviously the Great Depression comes to mind. But just in your lifetime and in my lifetime, we've had the LTCM crisis. We've had the tech bubble. We've had the great financial crisis. We've had, so many of these. And looking back, it's easy. And maybe this is part of the evolutionary qualities that we have as humans. We kind of forget the pain because we have to move on. But the reality is, to some of us at the time, those were existential threats. Those were things that changed their lives forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I view this as everything happens for a reason, perhaps.
Right.
But I think in the wake of LTCM, the desire to take on important societal issues as opposed to perhaps just navigating the financial system for gain is what gave birth to integrated finance, right? And so I worked at integrated finance for a minute when I was a grad student to tie everything back together. You and I met at BU, some version of 2003, 2004. You said to me, well, everything you like about economics, this whole idea of decision making under uncertainty and some of the models that I thought were brilliant in terms of Arrow-Debreu optimization and states of the world. And of course, the idea of kind of game theory, or the idea that we're all operating in relation to one another and in a world of uncertainty. Well, you said all of that, we call that finance. So why don't you do that instead? Which, of course, was the beginning of our relationship. You shipped me off to Harvard once a week to take Bob's class, which he was kind enough to let me sit in as a fly on the wall, non-paying customer, I guess. Around that time, this is one of my favorite stories. I guess Bob was in a bit of an argument, a public argument with Nassim Taleb on the validity of how to think about finance from the standpoint of what you would describe as Mertonian economics, Mertonian finance. And I wrote a piece that laid out why Nassim Taleb was wrong about something, though I think he's right about a lot of things. I think Taleb had many, many important insights about the fact that it seems to me we keep getting surprised by the unexpected, so maybe we should start expecting the unexpected. But along the way, Nassim Taleb accused me of, I guess, being a nom de plume, a facade for Bob Merton, which was really comical. But that's around the time that I started working for integrated finance. So, I mean, there's so much we could talk about, and you've had a lifetime of being an advocate for the American investor is the way I would describe it, in the same way that, I think people like Jason Zweig are advocates for the American investor, for the American investing public. You've often pointed to things like incentives in financial services and the fact that there is misalignment. You've talked about things like regulatory capture, which is when you start receiving, let's just call it, government-stamped information that may not be serving you, but actually might be serving the industry. But you recently wrote a new textbook, right? You have one of the most influential textbooks in, well, certainly in the history of modern business schools, investments, the Bodie Marcus. You've written other textbooks along the way, but tell me about the new book.
Okay, so this is a publication of Cambridge University Press, co-authored by none other than Bob Merton and a more recent student of his, Richard Thacker, who's the son of a financial economist, as well as being a PhD from MIT, and is now a tenured professor at the University of Minnesota. So the three of us decided to write a modern, basic finance. It's called Principles of Finance. So it's a book designed for first year MBA students and undergrads as well in finance. And it's got 20 chapters and is divided into three parts. Unlike most introductory textbooks in finance, it's got a big emphasis on personal finance and investing in the first part of the book. It's got a big emphasis on option pricing and option pricing models and the thinking that goes behind option pricing models. And it's got a part that's corporate finance, applications of corporate finance, and a chapter or two on functional finance, which we talked about earlier. It's different from other textbooks in that structure.
And just to be very clear on the way I would think about the application of option theory and why it's different, people understand viscerally that the world is uncertain and the future. It's the old Yogi Berra. Predictions are really hard, particularly about the future, because, of course, the future is uncertain. But the concept of option pricing and option theory is, the uncertain future isn't just a blob. There is structure there that you can exploit to kind of slice the uncertain future into different segments. One future could be one that is to the downside. One part of the future is one that could be to the upside. And so the moment you understand that it's not just a blob of throwing your hands in the air and just saying, I don't know what's going to happen next, then you can actually hedge it, buy insurance, so on and so forth. So that's why thinking in option terms is so powerful.
It's also the option pricing approach behind the model is an alternative to the discounted cash flow approach to valuation.
Right.
And therefore, risky assets, you have to decide, do I want to use a discounted cash flow model? Do I want to use an option pricing type of model?
Yeah. What's the name of the book? I forget.
Principles of Finance.
Well, that's to the point.
Yeah.
I love it. We're going to be closing up in a few minutes. We have a few more minutes, but I do want to hit a couple of big topics before we get to our rapid fire questions. The first big topic, and I think we've touched on it, but I really want to get your answer on the record. In your lifetime, what is the wildest or most surprising things you've seen when it comes to market psychology?
Well, I don't know that I would call it strict market psychology, but it is the thing that we've talked about that came up in my experience with the example of LTCM, where participants of the market just, in that case, there was something that triggered it, but there's this herding phenomenon where everybody runs away from something.
Yeah, I think there's herding. I think there's another part to that story, which is about psychology and the perception of invincibility and the fact that having the quote unquote smartest guys in the room, and you noted there were only men, at least certainly in the headline names, will insulate you from bad outcomes. And the reality is it's not so. And so have some humility. I think that's the psychological aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
Perception of invincibility. And again, I go back to the top of our conversation. A lot of things that aren't supposed to be happening end up happening. And recognizing that and acknowledging it is, I think, gives you psychological strength as opposed to fragility. I guess borrowing from Nassim Taleb's preferred terminology of fragility. All right, another question. If there's one thing about investing and risk and all of that, the whole body of understanding that you wish you'd known when you were 20, what would it be?
I guess the importance of saving, really, it's difficult when you're that age and you come from a family that doesn't, you know, not rich, but preparing for adversity, I would say. Saving, but even before you start thinking about saving for retirement, thinking about saving for a rainy day. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Really important.
Well, again, going right back to where we were just a second ago, bad things do happen, be ready for them.
Correct.
Okay, now we're going to go to the other end of the timeline. You know, you're now retired and you just wrote a textbook and you're active in so many ways. But in this phase of life, how has this phase of life changed your perspective on meaning and fulfillment and all of that?
Well, basically, for me, it means handing things over to the next generation, learning to adjust your ego so that you don't have to be at the top of the heap. So that's the first thing in terms of cultivating the next generation, in particular in my family. And the importance of friends, very important. Otherwise, you can get lonely.
I think the importance of community is true throughout. And as you know, this is something that certainly Mariah, your daughter, has championed, which is the importance of building a community, maintaining a community, being intentional about it, friendships. And I think it's so critical because of those two phenomena, which is, never mind the fact that it feeds the soul on an ongoing basis. But the reality is, again, to the extent that we're all going to have hardships, we're human and we're all going to have our things, being surrounded by people who care, people who kind of can catch you when that happens is really important. And to your point, it creates resilience through the course of your lifetime, whether it's stepping into retirement or some version of retirement, stepping into being an empty nester. All of those things are moments when it's better to not be alone and to have cultivated deep, meaningful friendships. That's certainly the way I've experienced it, and it's something that I've learned. When you met me, I was kind of a loner. There was so much kind of stranger danger in those years, and me recognizing that more people is good, more connectivity is good. It certainly has been a gift to me over the last 20 odd years. I really mean this because I think it is one of your greatest accomplishments is your ability to communicate to non-experts, and not just your ability to do it, but your commitment to it. And so, what's the drive there? Was it just a lane that was open and you happened to have an aptitude because all the other guys were just gung-ho on being jargon, Latin, and technicians? Or was there another drive?
The drive was, I get from teaching. I love, just like I used to, I think I mentioned earlier that I loved school. And being a teacher, I was involved with schooling. And I still sort of view myself primarily as a teacher. In fact, I'm thinking about my next project, and it needs to be something about involving financial literacy, because I think that's something I know about. And there's nothing that gives me greater pleasure than teaching other people things they didn't know.
Yeah, I think that's right.
In fact, just the other day I was thinking about this. I go to physical therapy because everybody I know goes to physical therapy. You got to go to physical therapy. There's this young assistant therapist there, and I was explaining about I bonds. There are Series I savings bonds to her. And that was the best physical therapy session I ever had.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. Sharing knowledge is a real gift. All right. We have a closing kind of rapid fire set of questions. Of course, being a Frenchman, I attribute them to Bernard Pivot, but they were adopted and adapted by James Lipton in the Inside the Actor Studio TV show. So I'm sure you'll recognize some of these questions. Are you ready for just rapid fire, open-ended?
Yes.
You can take a broad interpretation of the questions.
Okay.
Okay. What is your favorite word?
Health.
What is your least favorite word?
Anxiety.
What is your favorite drug?
Aspirin.
What is a sound or a noise you love?
Songs.
Any particular song?
Yeah, I really like cabaret.
What is a sound or a noise you hate?
Siren, like of an ambulance.
I know you don't engage in that type of behavior too much, but what is your favorite curse word?
Yeah.
Who would you like to see on a new banknote?
I'd like to see the flag of the United States.
I like it. Not a person, a concept.
Right.
What profession other than your own would you not want to attempt?
Surgery.
If you were reincarnated as a plant or an animal, what would it be?
Hydrangeas.
Okay. Tell me more.
Well, I just love the way hydrangeas look. Different colored hydrangeas. And they last for a long time.
And obviously, Judy's garden is a testament to those.
Absolutely.
All right, one last question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive?
He was a good husband, father, and grandfather.
Well, all those things are true. So the good news, Zvi, is you have a lifetime of backing up those claims. And I think of what you just said earlier about wanting to teach the next generation. Well, you've literally committed your lifetime to it. So thank you.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.
This podcast is for entertainment and education only. Nothing here is financial advice. Treussard Capital Management is a registered investment advisor. Please visit our website, .treussard.com, for additional information and disclaimers.